of the boring history for sleep. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we'll gently explore one of the most mysterious and haunting chapters of human history: the Black Plague. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Feel free to leave a comment. Are you ready for rest? Take a deep breath. Get cozy. Let the weight of the day melt away. And let's begin. It was the early 1340s, and medieval Europe was stable, at least by its own standards. Kingdoms were feuding, peasants were working, and trade routes stretched like veins across the continent, carrying goods, ideas, and unknowingly, a future catastrophe. But to the average villager in France or England, life remained as it had for generations: hard, predictable, and deeply tied to the land and the church. The majority of the population lived in rural villages. Most people were peasants or serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They lived in simple homes of wood or waterland daub, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. A family's world was small: the manor, the church, the fields, and the woods beyond. A space that rarely expanded further than 10 miles in any direction. Daily life was driven by the seasons. Spring brought ploughing and planting. Summer meant tending the fields. Autumn was for the harvest. Winter brought rest, hunger, and prayer. There was no electricity, no clock to wake you, only sunrise and the tolling of the church bell. The diet was modest and repetitive. Bread was the staple, coarse and dark, made from rye or barley. Meat was rare for peasants. They relied on pottage, a stew of vegetables and grains, supplemented with eggs, cheese, onions, and ale. Salt was valuable. Sugar was a luxury. Spices were mostly reserved for the nobility, who dined better and often lived longer, though not always. Clothing was functional. Most people wore wool, dyed with natural materials like woad or onion skins. Linen was worn beneath to keep the itchy wool off the skin. The upper classes distinguished themselves with fur, embroidery, and fine tailoring. But for most, a single tunic might last years, patched and mended many times over. Trade was growing. Europe was not isolated. Thanks to the Pax Mongolica, goods from the east, silk, spices, porcelain, flowed through the Silk Road into the trading cities of the Mediterranean. Genoa and Venice were powerful port cities. Constantinople, still vibrant under Byzantine rule, served as a gateway between worlds. Ships carried fabrics, wine, wool, and grain across the sea. With them came sailors, rats, and the invisible passengers that would soon devastate half the known world. Politically, tensions simmered. The 100 Years' War between England and France had just begun in 1337, over competing claims to the French crown. It was the backdrop of much anxiety and regional instability, but few believed it would affect them personally. War, like the weather, was something that happened elsewhere. Religion shaped every aspect of life. The Catholic Church stood as the supreme moral and cultural authority. From baptism to burial, every major life event was mediated through the clergy. Most people couldn't read Latin, and the Bible was not available in their language. But they listened, they believed. They feared God and hell in equal measure, and they donated to their local church in hopes of easing their souls in the afterlife. Heaven was real, so was purgatory, so were demons. Superstition walked hand in hand with theology. It was believed that eclipses were signs from God, that illness was divine punishment, and that relics of saints could cure disease. Yet not all was backward. Towns were growing. Universities were thriving in places like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. Medical texts, largely based on Galen and Arabic translations, were circulated among learned physicians. People sought to understand the body through the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, they believed, came from imbalances, bad air, and celestial misalignment, explanations that, while incorrect, still represented a genuine effort to comprehend nature. By 1345, rumors had begun circulating among merchants. Tales from the East. Ships leaving the ports of the Black Sea had been found adrift, their crews dead or dying. In Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, it was said that Mongol forces had laid siege to the city and, in an act of desperation, catapulted infected corpses over the walls. This was no ordinary sickness. Victims developed black swellings under their arms or groin, buboes followed by fever, vomiting, and death within days. Some died even faster, bleeding from the nose or lungs, collapsing in the streets. It moved like fire through kindling dot. But Europe, for the most part, continued on. The ships kept sailing. The markets remained open. The pilgrims journeyed. Life was too busy to stop for distant rumors. Most Europeans had never heard of Kaffa. What did it matter what happened in some port city near the Caspian Sea? In the absence of modern science, there was no sense of microbial threat. Disease was either an act of God or a mystery. There were no quarantines, no understanding of rats or fleas, no hand-washing rituals outside of religious rites. There were simply the usual concerns: taxes, drought, harvests, wars. Life, in all its daily struggle, simply moved forward. But beneath the normalcy, the storm was already forming. To understand how the Black Death arrived in Europe, one must first look east to the shores of the Black Sea, to the tangled trade routes of the Silk Road, and to a place called Kaffa, now known as Feodosia, a modest port city in Crimea. In the mid-14th century, Kaffa was not just a city. It was a vital artery in the vast circulatory system of international trade. Kaffa was controlled by the Republic of Genoa, one of the major maritime powers of the time. Alongside Venice, Genoa had established a dense network of trading colonies and ports throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. It was a hub of commerce, bustling, multilingual, and strategically positioned between Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Mongol-controlled territories of the East. In 1346, Kaffa found itself under siege. The attackers were the Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that had ruled over large portions of modern-day Russia and Central Asia since the time of Genghis Khan. Relations between Genoese traders and their Mongol counterparts had deteriorated, leading to a brutal and prolonged military standoff. The city, though fortified, was cornered and under immense pressure. Then came the sickness. It began subtly. A few soldiers in the Mongol camps fell ill. High fevers, strange swellings, death within days. Then it spread. Before long, entire ranks were decimated. Panic rippled through the besieging forces. Historians still debate the full truth of what happened next, but one version retold by chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, a notary in Piacenza, would become legend. According to de Mussi, in a grim act of desperation and retaliation, the Mongols catapulted the corpses of their infected dead over the city walls of Kaffa. Whether this early form of biological warfare truly happened or was embellished by terrified observers remains uncertain. But the results, regardless of method, were the same. The disease entered the city. Once inside, it spread rapidly. The Genoese merchants, recognizing the threat but not fully understanding it, fled by ship, attempting to outrun the disease across the sea. Their goal was home ports like Messina, Genoa, and Venice. They believed the wind would carry them to safety. Instead, it carried death. Those Genoese ships became floating coffins. Accounts from the time describe sailors dying at sea, bodies thrown overboard mid-journey, and ports refusing to accept ships for fear of contamination. But fear, in the 14th century, had no framework. There was no germ theory, no comprehension of contagion in the modern sense. Some believed the disease came from bad air or the alignment of the planets. Others saw it as divine punishment, a reckoning for sin. Still, despite fear and rumor, the ships docked in October 1347. A fleet of Genoese trading ships landed at the port of Messina, on the island of Sicily. According to contemporary sources, the ships arrived with most of their crews already dead or dying. The citizens of Messina, unaware of what was about to unfold, rushed to help. They carried the sick off the boats, buried the dead, tended to the survivors. Within days, the disease began spreading through the city. The symptoms were horrific by medieval standards. Victims developed blackened swellings, buboes around the groin, neck, and armpits. High fevers followed. Many vomited blood. Death came swiftly, often within 3 to 5 days. In some cases, people died within 24 hours of showing signs. Word spread quickly, but the disease spread faster from Messina. The plague moved outward, hitching rides on every available vessel. By January 1348, it had reached Genoa and Marseille. In Venice, where the Republic prided itself on order and record-keeping, the government attempted some of the first known quarantine measures. Ships were held at bay, and travelers were isolated. But even Venice, with its experience in managing trade-based health risks, could not stop what was coming. The movement of the disease was not limited to ships. It traveled along trade routes, moving inland through caravans, carts, and roads, carried by the fleas on rats that infested cargo holds, grain sacks, and warehouses. Rats were everywhere. In 14th century Europe, under floors, behind walls, scurrying along docks, nesting in monasteries and manors alike. No one suspected them. Within weeks of reaching the ports, the plague appeared in inland towns, Pisa, Florence, Toulon, Avignon, the city of the Pope himself. By mid-1348, it was in Paris. In 1349, it crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. It did not strike evenly. Some towns were devastated, losing over half their populations. Others were mysteriously spared or suffered less. But few regions escaped entirely. the ports, open doors to the world, had unknowingly welcomed an invisible invader, one that would go on to claim the lives of an estimated 25 to 50 million people across Europe. And yet, in 1347, as those first ships docked in Sicily, there was still hope. As the year 1348 began, the plague that had crept ashore in Sicily was no longer a curiosity confined to foreign ports. It was now a force, invisible, unrelenting, and terrifying, moving across Europe with the persistence of weather. But unlike a storm, it gave no warning. There were no thunderclaps, no darkening skies, only silence, then sickness, then death. Europe was not prepared. Medieval towns were not designed with sanitation in mind. Streets were narrow and clogged with refuse. Human and animal waste often mingled in open ditches. Livestock wandered freely. Homes were crowded, often with entire families, and sometimes animals, living under a single roof. Clean water was unreliable. Rats were everywhere, and no one, not the poor nor the wealthy, understood how disease truly spread. By the spring of 1348, the plague had settled into its grim rhythm. It arrived in a town like a rumor. First, a traveler fell ill, then a baker's boy, then half a parish. The symptoms were unmistakable and unlike anything most had ever seen. Swellings, often dark or purple, appeared beneath the arms or near the groin. These buboes, as they came to be known, were extremely painful and often followed by fever, vomiting, delirium, and death. In some variations, now understood as pneumonic or septicemic plague, victims died without buboes, sometimes in a single day. Once the disease took root in a town, it spread with astonishing speed. There were few hospitals. The concept of organized public health was all but non-existent. Some cities, like Venice and Dubrovnik, tried to isolate ships and visitors, a policy that would later evolve into quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. But for the most part, towns and villages were left to fend for themselves. In many places, civic order collapsed. In Florence, the chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio described scenes that would become typical across Europe. Families abandoned sick relatives. Parents left infected children. Corpses were dragged into the streets or piled into mass graves, often buried without ceremony. Priests and doctors, few to begin with, were overwhelmed or fled. Those who stayed often died soon after. In cities like Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, things were no better. At the height of the plague, it is said that Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the entire Rhine River so that the dead could be tossed into it en masse when burial grounds overflowed. The papal court burned fires around the Pope's chambers in an effort to purify the air, a practice rooted in the belief that miasma, or bad air, caused disease. The silence of the plague was not just physical, it was social, psychological, spiritual. People stopped speaking to one another in the streets. Town criers no longer announced the day's events. Church bells tolled constantly, not to mark hours, but to signal the dead. Monasteries emptied, markets closed. The rhythm of daily life, once measured by ploughs, prayers, and parish feasts, was replaced by uncertainty and fear. Many turned to religion for answers. Public processions of flagellants appeared across Europe. These were groups of men who marched from town to town, shirtless and bleeding, whipping themselves in repentance for the sins of humanity. They believed the plague was God's punishment, and that self-inflicted suffering might ease divine wrath. Their numbers grew quickly. In some regions, they were welcomed, in others, feared. The Church, wary of their extremism and unapproved practices, eventually condemned the movement. Others turned on their neighbors. In Germany and elsewhere, rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells or conspired to spread the plague. These baseless accusations ignited a wave of violence. In cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz, entire Jewish populations were massacred or expelled. These events, now understood as some of the worst anti-Jewish pogroms of the Middle Ages, were driven by panic, scapegoating, and the desperate human need to assign blame. The countryside was no safer. Villages emptied overnight. Fields were left untended. Livestock wandered loose or starved. In some places, as much as half the population perished within months. In others, the toll was even greater. Chroniclers struggled to find words. One wrote that so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Another claimed that no bells tolled, no prayers were said, for none remained to pray. Yet even in the face of so much loss, some people adapted. Gravediggers worked day and night. City councils tried with varying success to implement burial protocols and burning of infected items. In England, royal writs attempted to regulate the movement of goods and people. Though enforcement was limited, medical treatises were copied and distributed, containing remedies that ranged from herbal concoctions to utterly useless superstition. Some people wore posies of herbs to ward off bad air. Others carried pomanders, or citrus fruits filled with cloves, pressed against their noses. Nothing worked. Still, the plague moved on, often retreating for weeks, only to return again without warning. Its pattern was unpredictable. Some towns were devastated, neighboring villages left untouched. In some places, the rich died alongside the poor. In others, wealth brought isolation and sometimes survival. But wherever it went, the plague left the same result. Silence, empty homes, deserted streets, abandoned fields, graves, shallow and deep. A silence so complete that it was said birds stopped singing. And in that silence, survivors whispered a single question: would anything ever return to the way it was? While the plague is most famously remembered for its devastation in Europe, its roots and reach were far broader. Long before it arrived in Messina or Paris, the disease had already carved a grim path across Asia. The Middle East and North Africa, centuries-old civilizations, brought to their knees, not by war or invasion, but by something far smaller and far more silent. The Black Death is believed to have originated in the steppes of Central Asia, likely in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. In 2011, scientists traced genetic markers of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, to Issyk, a region that was, at the time, part of a complex trade web connected to the Mongol Empire. Archaeological evidence even includes gravestones dated to the 1330s, bearing inscriptions of sudden mass death, possibly marking one of the first major outbreaks. From there, the disease likely spread along the Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes connecting China, India, Persia, and the Islamic world with Europe. These routes were lifelines of goods and knowledge, but they were also highways for disease. By the mid-1340s, the plague reached Samarkand, Tashkent, and other caravan cities. Traders, soldiers, and nomads moved constantly, and the Mongol Empire, known for creating relatively safe trade zones under the Pax Mongolica, may have unintentionally accelerated the spread. Ironically, the very conditions that encouraged prosperity, open roads, secured travel, bustling marketplaces, now enabled catastrophe. From Central Asia, the plague journeyed southwest, entering Persia, modern-day Iran. The famed scholar Ibn al-Wardi, writing from Aleppo in 1348, claimed the disease had decimated vast swaths of the land. He noted that in Trebizond and Tbilisi, entire communities were emptied of people. In Tabriz, one of the major cities of the Ilkhanate, the death toll was so catastrophic that contemporaries claimed 2/3 of the population perished in less than a year. Persian chronicles refer to a pestilence so swift that no one could bury the dead, nor mourn the lost. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the plague entered through trading routes that linked cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Aleppo to the Mediterranean. Baghdad, once the heart of Islamic scholarship and home to the legendary House of Wisdom, had already suffered political and economic decline following the Mongol sack of 1258. The plague only deepened the wounds. By 1347, it had reached Mosul, Erbil, and eventually Damascus, one of the most populous and cosmopolitan cities in the Islamic world. Damascus was well governed, a city of scholars, artisans, and merchants, but it was unprepared. The historian Ibn Battuta, who visited shortly after, recorded that over 2,000 people were dying every day at the plague's peak. Mosques overflowed with funeral prayers. Streets once crowded with scholars and traders fell silent. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and much of the Levant, issued public fasts and religious processions. Scholars debated whether the plague was a punishment or a trial. People took refuge in faith and in flight. Further west, the plague reached Cairo, then the thriving capital of the Mamluk Sultanate and one of the richest cities in the world. Cairo was a center of trade and religious authority, with a population possibly exceeding 500,000. When the plague arrived in 1349, it tore through the population with terrifying speed. Contemporary reports estimate that Cairo lost up to 200,000 people in a matter of months. Eyewitnesses describe corpses piling up faster than they could be buried. Al-Makrizi, a prominent Egyptian historian, wrote that burial pits were dug day and night and still could not keep up. Markets closed, schools emptied, entire districts fell silent. Across the Mediterranean, the disease leapt to North Africa, carried by ships and traders. It struck Tunis, Algiers, and Fez, devastating port cities and inland towns alike. The famous city of Tlemcen, once a thriving crossroads of trade and scholarship, suffered staggering losses. So did the intellectual and religious centers of Kairouan and Marrakesh. In the Islamic world, the response to the plague was shaped by theology and legal tradition. While some scholars saw it as divine punishment, others interpreted it as a test of patience and submission to God. One well-known saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that one should neither enter nor flee from a land where plague is present, shaped public behavior. In some cases, people stayed in afflicted towns, despite the risk, believing that to do otherwise would defy God's will. Interestingly, the Islamic world did not scapegoat minorities to the extent that Europe did. Jewish communities in Cairo and Damascus, for example, were not subjected to the pogroms that swept through the Holy Roman Empire. The reaction, while still steeped in spiritual interpretation, was often more organized and less hysterical than in parts of Europe. Even far to the east, in India and parts of China, records suggest the presence of plague outbreaks, though details are sparse. The Yuan dynasty in China had faced massive mortality events in the 1330s, especially in regions like Hubei and Hunan. Some modern historians believe these were earlier plague outbreaks tied to the same larger pandemic system, though Chinese sources do not describe them in the same terms. By the time the plague reached Europe, it was not a new crisis, it was simply Europe's turn. Millions had already died in cities and deserts most Europeans would never hear of. The disease had traveled from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Nile Delta, across mountains, oceans, steppes, and sand. It had touched the caliphates, the khanates, the sultanates, and now it was moving westward, toward the cathedrals and castles of Christendom. And always, it traveled with the wind, on a merchant's breath, a sailor's sleeve, a flea's bite, whispering across borders long before anyone knew they were open. From the moment the Genoese ships docked in Messina in October 1347, the plague began its march across the continent, following trade routes like ink bleeding through parchment. It spread with startling speed. Within months, it reached Marseille and Genoa. By early 1348, it had entered the heart of France and the trading cities of northern Italy, Florence, Pisa, and Venice. The disease moved inland with caravans, along Roman roads, and up rivers. From Paris to Bruges, from Krakow to Cologne, it seeped into markets, monasteries, and manors. In England, it landed at the port of Melcombe Regis in 1348. Within a year, it had reached London, and by 1350, even the remote edges of Scotland and Norway were in mourning. Cities were especially vulnerable. Florence may have lost 50,000 of its 100,000 citizens. Paris buried thousands in mass graves outside the city walls. In London, entire parishes vanished. In rural areas, some villages disappeared entirely, fields left untended, homes rotting into the earth. They would be called lost villages for centuries. The social impact was immediate and strange. With laborers dying by the thousands, wages rose. Some surviving peasants, once bound to the land, began to demand payment. The foundations of feudalism cracked. Nobles tried to enforce old laws. Revolts simmered beneath the surface. Religion faltered. Many clergy died ministering to the sick, and with them, trust in the church weakened. Some people became more devout. Others turned away completely. The world had shifted, and not everyone believed it would return to what it was. The plague, having no mind or mercy, continued until it had swept nearly all of Europe. By the time it subsided around 1352, between 30% and 60% of the continent's population had died. But the echoes of that time, of empty fields, silent towns, and grieving cities, would ring through Europe for generations. What set the Black Death apart from other illnesses of its time was not only the staggering number of deaths, but the nature of the disease itself. It struck suddenly, progressed rapidly, and presented with symptoms that were terrifying, unmistakable, and, to the people of the 14th century, inexplicable. Today, we understand that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It is most commonly transmitted by fleas that are fed on infected rodents, particularly black rats, which were common in medieval towns and ships. However, at the time, there was no concept of bacteria or infection in the modern sense. The disease's effects were observed, feared, and often described in vivid detail by those who lived through it. Historical records identify three main forms of plague during the 14th century pandemic: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each presented with its own symptoms, mortality rates, and speed of onset. Bubonic plague. This was the most common and widely reported form. The first signs typically appeared within 2 to 6 days of infection. Victims would begin to feel feverish, fatigued, and unwell. What might seem at first like the onset of influenza, but the disease progressed quickly. One of the hallmark symptoms was the formation of buboes, swollen, inflamed lymph nodes that appeared most often in the groin, armpits, or neck. These could grow to the size of an egg or an apple, often darkening in color to a deep purple or black. They were excruciatingly painful and frequently ruptured. Alongside the buboes came high fever, headache, chills, muscle pain, and a general sense of weakness. Many also experienced nausea and vomiting. As the infection advanced, delirium and mental confusion were common, sometimes resulting in erratic behavior or hallucinations. Without treatment, which did not exist at the time, the mortality rate for bubonic plague in the 14th century was estimated between 60% and 70%, depending on the quality of care and the individual's immune system. Most victims died within a week of the first symptoms. Pneumonic plague. This was the second most common form, and it was considerably more dangerous due to its mode of transmission. Unlike bubonic plague, which required the bite of an infected flea, pneumonic plague was airborne. It occurred when the bacteria infected the lungs, either directly primary pneumonic plague, or as a complication of untreated bubonic plague, secondary pneumonic plague. Symptoms of pneumonic plague included severe chest pain, difficulty breathing, bloody or frothy cough, extreme fatigue and fever, rapid respiratory failure. This form of the disease could be spread through droplets in the air by coughing or sneezing, making it contagious in a way that terrified medieval observers. Pneumonic plague had a shorter incubation period, often just 1 to 3 days, and it could kill within 24 to 48 hours. In many cases, entire households died within days of one person falling ill. Because of its rapid progression and ease of transmission, pneumonic plague was responsible for many of the high mortality outbreaks in dense urban environments. Septicemic plague. This form was the rarest, but also the most lethal. Septicemic plague occurred when the infection entered the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic system or lungs. It could be a result of untreated bubonic plague or occur on its own. Unlike the other two forms, septicemic plague often produced no visible buboes or respiratory symptoms, making it especially mysterious and terrifying in the 14th century. Symptoms included sudden onset of fever and chills, rapid heart rate, low blood pressure, bleeding under the skin, darkening of fingers, toes, and nose due to clotting and necrosis. The skin could turn black, especially in the extremities, a detail some scholars believe contributed to the name Black Death. Septicemic plague often killed its victims within hours, sometimes before any external signs had fully developed. Death rates approached 100% without treatment. To the people of the Middle Ages, the symptoms of the plague were both a physical and spiritual horror. The black swellings, the stench of infected bodies, and the rapid deaths defied understanding. Medical knowledge was based on Galenic theory, which emphasized imbalances of bodily humors, Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of aromatic herbs to cleanse the air. Some doctors wore beaked masks filled with spices, believing it would protect them from the foul miasma believed to cause disease. Others turned to more mystical remedies, burning sulfur, wearing amulets, or resorting to flagellation to atone for imagined sins. Doctors and priests often fled, and those who remained were quickly overwhelmed. Chroniclers describe streets lined with bodies, homes sealed from the outside, and silence broken only by coughing and wailing. Beyond the physical suffering, the symptoms of the plague created a deep emotional and cultural trauma. Families were often struck all at once. A mother might bury her children and fall sick the next morning. A village might go from celebration to mourning in a single week. The visibility of the disease, the buboes, the blackened skin, the sudden collapse created an atmosphere of fear and helplessness. There was no cure. There was no explanation that satisfied. There was only the inevitable decline, and then death. Though centuries have passed, the records of those symptoms remain, not just in parchment or ink, but in the memory of civilization. The fear of sudden, invisible illness, of neighbors falling ill overnight, of the body betraying itself. All of it begins with the same story: a swelling, a fever, a whisper in the night. In the years when the Black Death moved like a shadow over continents, faith and fear became inseparable. God was sought in whispers, in chants, in processions. And when answers did not come, people created their own. The 14th century was a profoundly religious time. In Europe, the Catholic Church was not only a spiritual authority, it was the backbone of political power, education, and social order. Most people believed, without question, that the events of the world were governed by divine will. Disease, therefore, could only be understood as punishment or trial. There were no accidents in God's universe. As the plague spread, churches filled with frightened parishioners. In towns across Italy, France, England, and beyond, people clutched rosaries, lit candles, and pleaded for mercy. Priests read aloud the Psalms, particularly Psalm 91, believed to offer protection from pestilence. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. But many priests, especially in hard-hit areas, died quickly. Entire monasteries were wiped out. In some places, the clergy was so reduced that priests were being ordained after just a few days of training, barely able to read Latin. With familiar channels of religious comfort collapsing, people sought new ones, or darker ones. In Germany, the flagellant movement surged in popularity. These were bands of penitents who believed that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Groups of men, stripped to the waist, would march barefoot through cities and villages, beating themselves with iron-tipped scourges, chanting hymns, and begging forgiveness. They would perform in the public square for 33.5 days, the number symbolizing Christ's years on earth, before moving on to the next town. Spectacle mixed with desperation. Initially, many welcomed the flagellants, hoping their devotion would appease God. But their message grew more apocalyptic. They claimed the church had grown corrupt. They accused bishops of greed. They began preaching without authorization, and eventually they turned their wrath toward outsiders. That is when the fear shifted to blame. Across Central and Western Europe, Jewish communities became the targets of increasingly violent accusations. It was claimed that Jews had poisoned wells, plotted the downfall of Christendom, or invoked witchcraft to bring the plague. There was no truth to any of it, but truth did not matter. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day in 1349. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was expelled, their synagogue demolished. In dozens of cities, from the Rhineland to Spain, similar massacres followed. Sometimes the accusations came from panicked villagers. Sometimes they were fueled by civic leaders hoping to cancel debts owed to Jewish lenders. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued papal bulls condemning these actions, stating that the plague was a punishment from God, not the result of human conspiracy. But papal authority meant little when fear ruled. Once panic took hold, mobs obeyed no laws, only emotion. In the Islamic world, responses took a different tone. The plague was also understood in religious terms, but there was less emphasis on guilt. According to Islamic teachings, plague was a martyrdom for the faithful and a test from God, something to be endured with patience rather than feared as punishment. One hadith, attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, taught that those who remained in a plague-affected land with faith would be rewarded in the afterlife. As a result, many Muslim communities focused not on fleeing, but on maintaining social order and prayer. In Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, public fasts and supplications were held. The historian Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who lived through the plague in Cairo, lost several of his children but continued to write and record. His grief is visible in his writings, but so too is his spiritual discipline. In many ways, Islamic scholars responded to the plague not with panic, but with pens, documenting, interpreting, and preserving. In Jewish communities, the response was twofold: mourning their dead and fleeing from violence. Some communities, like those in Poland and Lithuania, were spared both the plague and the pogroms, possibly due to geographic isolation or royal protection. For others, particularly in Spain and Germany, the plague marked the beginning of centuries of marginalization. And yet, amid the terror and loss, some found ways to hope. Mystical movements flourished. Christian mystics spoke of visions of angels weeping over Europe. New saints were venerated. Art began to reflect the scale of the suffering. Skeletons danced across murals. Time and death became subjects of poetry. This was the birth of the memento mori tradition. Remember that you must die, not as a fear tactic, but as a way to live honestly. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, surviving clergy tried to rebuild their congregations. Rural priests, often the last figures of leadership left, buried the dead, comforted the sick, and held fast to ritual, even if no one remained to attend. Some believed the world was ending. Others believed it had already ended. And yet, fields still needed plowing. Children were still born. Bells still rang. The fear would never fully vanish, but nor would faith. And somewhere in the quiet spaces, left behind by the plague in the empty chapels, the burned-out synagogues, the cleared courtyards where flagellants once bled, the idea of a different world began to take root. One with new questions, one with fewer certainties, but one that, somehow, still kept moving forward. When the Black Death loosened its grip on Europe around 1352, it did not announce its departure. There were no celebrations, no feasts, no sense of victory. It left slowly, uncertainly, and in many places, only temporarily. What remained in its wake was not simply loss, it was change. The kind of deep structural change that no one plans for and no one forgets. Across Europe, the numbers told the story. Some cities lost half their population. Entire villages vanished, swallowed by weeds and silence. In England, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the population is estimated to have died. In parts of Italy, the figure may have been higher. The dead were not just numbers. They were laborers, priests, mothers, judges, scholars, children. Their absence was everywhere. And yet, where one order collapses, something new always rises. In the years before the plague, most peasants were bound to land through feudal obligations, expected to work for their lords in exchange for protection and the right to live on the land. But when entire villages emptied and crops went unharvested, landowners found themselves desperate for workers. This desperation shifted the balance of power. Peasants began to demand wages, better conditions, and the freedom to move to towns or to other lords who offered more. In some cases, they simply walked away from their obligations altogether. The old system of serfdom, already strained by decades of economic stress, began to crack. Landowners pushed back. Laws were passed to freeze wages and restrict movement, most notably England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, but enforcement proved difficult when half your workforce was gone. For the first time in centuries, labour had leverage. The economic shock created unexpected winners: merchants, skilled artisans, and surviving landowners who could adapt found new opportunities. With less competition and rising wages, some former peasants began climbing the social ladder. Land became available. Inheritance became more likely. A small but growing middle class began to take shape, especially in towns. At the same time, the nobility struggled. Their income, tied to agricultural rents and fixed dues, plummeted. Some were forced to sell land, reduce retinues, or marry into wealthier common families. The hierarchy of the medieval world, long considered immovable, had begun to shift. The church had suffered terribly during the plague. Many of its most devoted members, priests, monks, and nuns, had died ministering to the sick. Others had fled, leaving parishes leaderless. In the years that followed, the church faced growing criticism and decline in moral authority. With so many clerical vacancies, the church had to ordain new priests quickly, often with little education or training. This led to complaints about corruption, ignorance, and the growing distance between church doctrine and the daily struggles of the laity. Though most people remained deeply religious, trust in institutional authority weakened. This erosion would quietly contribute to later movements: mystical revivalism, Lollardy in England, and eventually the Protestant Reformation a century later. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the Black Death was not death at all, but rebirth. In Italy, which had seen some of the worst mortality, something remarkable began to stir in the aftermath. With old structures broken, wealth redistributed, and the cultural shock of mortality in every mind, people began to think differently about life, art, and the human experience itself. Florence, devastated by the plague, became the cradle of the Renaissance. Survivors commissioned frescoes, funded universities, and began to celebrate individual achievement. The art became more personal, more emotional. Literature shifted toward realism, satire, and philosophy. In the decades after the plague, Petrarch would write of longing and memory. Boccaccio, having survived the plague in Florence, would pen the Decameron, a collection of human stories told by people hiding from death. Their works weren't just about beauty, they were about what it meant to survive. Across Europe, languages changed. Latin, long the language of the church and elite, began to yield more space to vernacular writing in English, French, Italian, and German. The voice of the common person was rising. Even science took cautious steps forward. While many doctors had failed to treat the plague, a small number of thinkers began to question ancient medical theories. They started to collect case studies, observe symptoms more closely, and challenge the idea that illness was purely divine punishment. The seeds of medical empiricism and eventually modern science had been quietly planted. The Black Death never entirely disappeared. It would return in waves over the next 4 centuries, though never again with quite the same fury. But its first sweep had permanently changed the texture of life. It altered who owned land, who worked it, who prayed, and how. It shifted economies, traditions, and even architecture, with entire cemeteries, ossuaries, and charnel houses, built to accommodate the loss. Perhaps the most direct and lasting legacy of the Black Death lies in how societies began to think about disease itself. For the first time, cities across Europe began to recognize the need for organized civic responses to illness. In Venice, one of the hardest hit cities and a hub of maritime trade, officials began implementing quarantine regulations as early as 1377. Incoming ships suspected of carrying disease were ordered to wait for 40 days before unloading. The origin of the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni. Guards were stationed at city gates. Sanitary boards were created to monitor public health. Over the following decades, these practices spread to Genoa, Ragusa, and Marseille, laying the foundation for modern public health infrastructure. In time, this new approach evolved into the building of lazarettos, isolation hospitals, often on islands, where the sick were kept apart from the healthy. Venice built the first in 1423 on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth. Others followed. These were imperfect, but revolutionary. Disease, for the first time in European history, was treated as a communal problem requiring collective action. This thinking would shape future responses to cholera, to typhus, to influenza, and centuries later, to pandemics in our own time. The demographic collapse of the Black Death redrew the physical map of Europe. With so many gone, cities shrank, not just in population, but in footprint. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Rural villages disappeared entirely. In England alone, more than 1,000 villages vanished, never to be resettled. Fields lay fallow. Woodlands regrew where farmland once stretched. The silence left by the dead allowed nature to reclaim space, altering ecosystems and even local climates. Some towns were rebuilt on a smaller scale. Others reimagined their layouts, widening streets, improving drainage, and reconsidering access to clean water. In some regions, wealthier survivors built larger homes, reflecting their newfound prosperity. The architecture of the post-plague world subtly shifted. Fewer grand cathedrals were begun, and more personal chapels, secular halls, and civic buildings emerged. Cities did not only mourn, they adapted. The trauma of the Black Death prompted an explosion of creativity, introspection, and innovation. In literature, the plague inspired some of the first modern narrative structures. In the Decameron, written by Giovanni Boccaccio, 10 young people flee Florence to escape the plague and entertain each other with stories. It's light-hearted at times, scandalous at others, but always shadowed by death. The framing device, a world in crisis, people seeking meaning through storytelling, would be copied for centuries. In art, the plague introduced a new visual language, the danse macabre, or dance of death. This motif showed skeletons leading the living kings, bishops, peasants to the grave, emphasizing mortality's reach. Paintings and woodcuts portrayed decay, judgment, and resurrection with startling honesty. From these images would come Northern Renaissance realism, with its emphasis on human frailty and detail. Music, too, reflected a new tone. Gregorian chants gave way to laments and folk songs. The lullabies of the period sometimes referenced the loss of children or the strange new silences of daily life. In time, the memory of the plague entered European folklore, embedding itself in the unconscious dark forests, cursed wells, ghosts by roadside shrines. And religion, so deeply shaken, saw the beginnings of dissent. While many clung more tightly to faith, others became cynical. Reformist voices grew louder. Movements like Lollardy in England and Hussitism in Bohemia questioned the Church's authority, its corruption, and its failure to explain suffering. These seeds of discontent would bloom in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation, which owed part of its momentum to the disillusionment first sown in plague years. For physicians, the Black Death was a crisis of both theory and practice. Medieval medicine relied heavily on the ancient teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, as interpreted through Arabic translations. Disease was thought to arise from imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal fumigation, and astrological alignment. But none of these approaches stopped the plague. The best physicians died alongside the untrained. Remedies failed. Prayers went unanswered. In the decades after the plague, medical writers began to change course. They wrote obsolete. They began compiling data. They described symptoms carefully, recorded transmission patterns, and debated environmental factors. It was not yet the scientific method, but it was a departure from blind faith in ancient texts. Some cities even began requiring medical licenses, a small but important step in professionalizing medicine. Universities like Montpellier, Bologna, and Padua grew in stature as centers for more rigorous, if still limited, medical education. Over the long term, these shifts helped pave the way for the scientific revolution, which would emerge in the centuries to come. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Black Death is not in buildings or books, but in memory, in how we speak about disease, in how we prepare, and in how we grieve. For centuries, people feared the next great pestilence. Plague outbreaks recurred in cycles, roughly every 10 to 20 years, until the 18th century. The second pandemic lasted more than 300 years in some form. It haunted trade, shaped diplomacy, and even altered military campaigns. The Great Plague of London in 1665, the Marseille outbreak of 1720, and the Russian plague of 1771 were all echoes of that first tidal wave in the 1340s. Each brought back the same fears, the same rituals, quarantine, mass burials, frantic prayer. In art and literature, the Black Death became a symbol of apocalypse, of divine wrath, of human frailty. From Shakespeare to Camus, writers would return again and again to the image of a city gripped by plague. Even today, the concept of plague doctors, with their bird-like masks and long black robes, remains an enduring symbol of disease, mystery, and death. And in 2020, when a new pandemic gripped the globe, comparisons to the Black Death quickly resurfaced. Headlines referenced it. Historians were called to explain it. People rediscovered Boccaccio and De Mussi. Social media revived the imagery of 14th century Europe, not because we expected the same scale, but because the questions about fear, blame, resilience, and survival remain the same. In the darkest years of the plague, when Europe had lost up to half its population, it seemed to some that the world might end, but it didn't. The candle flickered, but it did not go out.